Ever wondered what Griffith looked like underneath his helmet? How did he survive some of the most brutal torture in anime? And was Griffith a truly evil character? Hey guys, Dr. Maddie here from doc.offcall. Welcome back to today's video where we're going to be looking at the Berserk anime. Now, if you'd like me to cover any other aspect of this show, whether that's Guts' winter arc training or the Eclipse episode, just let me know down below. Otherwise, if you're ready, let's begin.
急所は外してるから命に別状はない。少なくとも3年間は生かすように国王から命じられているからね。
So first up, we have the insertion of needles into Griffith's body, and as the torturer states, he's trying to avoid all of the vital structures such as the heart, the lungs, the intestines, and all the major blood vessels. Interestingly, it's not uncommon that doctors or people with the most amount of medical knowledge ended up being the torturers. You see, their understanding of the human body would enable them to inflict the most amount of pain whilst keeping their victims alive. And the fact that Griffiths was a strong young man who'd been in several battles and taken several injuries would mean that he'd likely be able to endure all of the torture being inflicted on his body. And in the background of this guy's dungeon, we see other torture devices, such as the Iron Maiden device. To be honest, I can't believe such torture devices existed. You would have thought these were things of nightmares.
しかし人間には分相応というものがある。君ほどの英雄が。
Gosh, burning and scalding up next for Griffiths. And this is a really horrible form of torture. Not only do you feel the pain from the hot prong, but you can also hear and smell your flesh being melted, adding a further psychological component to this form of torture. And for someone like Griffiths, who used his good looks to woo the ladies and now and again woo the men, by permanently scarring and mutilating his appearance, you're attacking what Griffiths prided himself on. And again, the effectiveness of this kind of torture really comes down to that person who's administering it. For example, depending on the amount of pressure that's applied and the time that the prong is left on the skin for would determine the severity of the burn. And this is really important, as if the prongs are left on the skin too long, you could actually burn all of the pain sensory fibers found within the skin, rendering this form of torture useless.
一筋の光もない真の闇。この闇に身を浸して、もうどれだけの時が過ぎたのか。俺は正気を保っているのだろうか。
So here we see that Griffiths has begun to question whether he's maintaining his own sanity. He's been subjected to various forms of both physical and psychological torture, and being in this sensory deprived environment in the dungeon is seeming to have its toll. But what is the impact from this kind of sensory deprivation? Well, there is a form of torture known as white room torture, where victims are placed in a soundproof white cell with the goal of depriving them of all of their senses. Even their food appears white. And the effects of this form of torture are actually quite well documented. Seemingly, it tends to lead to a level of depersonalization, where in the isolation, people lose their sense of identity. Other reported effects have been hallucinations and psychosis, whereby you're no longer able to tell what is reality, and it looks like Griffiths has reached this stage.
ご拝謁賜りたく。
いずれかの地で相まみえようぞ。
Okay, so had I not known anything about the Berserk anime and I'd seen this scene, I would have said that's it, Griffiths becomes psychotic. Remember, all this means is that you might be seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, or you might believe something that's just not true and can't be convinced otherwise. But let's try and look at this from a real-life perspective. What is it about torture that can lead to psychosis? Well, we know that during trauma, this triggers a heightened stress response, leading to the release of stress hormones, such as cortisol. Now, prolonged exposure to stress hormones can modify both the structure and the function of the brain, leading you susceptible to becoming psychotic. Also, it's been found that people who've experienced torture can develop maladaptive coping strategies. These might include things like dissociation or creating alternate realities to better cope with the stressful situation. And it's these coping strategies which, while adaptive in the short term, can contribute to the formation of psychotic symptoms.
一つだけ鮮明なものがある。あいつだけが憎悪、友愛、嫉妬、悔しさ、虚しさ、それらすべてが。
So here we're really seeing the narcissistic traits of Griffiths. He blames Guts for his captivity rather than accepting and acknowledging that it's as a result of his behaviour and actions. You see, Griffiths always wanted to be the man on top, giving out orders and being worshipped by his underlings. And after being defeated by Guts, he acted out impulsively, wanting to exert and regain his control over someone, and did this by bedding the princess, which is ultimately what got him caught. However, although it's this personality trait that's got him into this situation, it may well also be his narcissism that's allowed him to survive this ordeal, where other men may have perished. So we finally see the state of Griffith's body here, and he looks like a shell of the man that he once was. Medically, we'd describe this appearance of weight loss and muscle wasting as cachexia, and it has its own implications. You see, when you no longer have any subcutaneous fat that's found under the skin, you no longer have any padding between your bones and the external environment. This can make even sitting or lying down painful. And whilst in this state, if you're having prolonged periods of immobility, this can lead you susceptible to developing pressure sores, which is where the skin begins to break down, becomes infected, and then leads to further tissue loss, making you an appetizing meal for vermin and rats living in this dungeon. I suspect with Griffiths having been thrown onto this dungeon floor, the agony of remaining still would probably have been torture enough.
手足の剣が切られてる。下も。キャスか、鍵だ!
So I'm guessing that Griffith's torturer cut his tendons so that he was unable to escape, which really adds to the horror of the situation. Not only is your body being mutilated, but you've got no means of defending yourself. And unfortunately, it's not like these tendons can just be reattached and that's it, you have restored functionality. Once they've been cut and severed, really the clock to which you've got time to reattach them begins to tick. Meaning that if they're not reattached promptly, the tissue dies and begins to rot away. And then removing of the tongue is often done to render the person mute, so that they're unable to tell any tales or stories of what they came across during their captivity. However, in Griffith's case, I seem to remember it being removed due to him constantly mocking the king and to help silence his rebellious tongue. Really, had he remained quiet, he may well have gotten off easier.
こんなはずはねえ。これがあのグリフィスのはずがねえ。
So I'm guessing as a form of mockery that they've kept this mask on Griffith's face from the days that he was the leader of the Band of Hawks. And from sketches of what I've seen of what Griffiths looks like under the mask, I'm not surprised that Guts is so shocked. I mean, he looks like a completely different person with multiple lacerations over his face, as well as areas where the flesh has been completely torn off. But this mask does remind me of a torture method that had been used during the medieval times, called the Scold's Bridles. This was mainly reserved for those people who were mainly women who were seen to be breaking the peace or who were outspoken, with this form of punishment to act as a form of public mockery to deter other women from doing the same. Another consideration for those women and Griffiths would be the weight of this helmet and never being able to really achieve any level of comfort. Imagine having to wear this for a whole year, both night and day, and even when you go to sleep at night, you're only met by cold steel against your head, rather than a soft pillow.
グリフィス、
And with that attempt to strangle Guts, we really see how weak Griffith has become. This is likely related to being in part due to malnourishment, but also due to the fact that he's unable to move. Consider this. Research has shown that you lose up to 6% of your muscle mass for every week that you remain immobile. And so for a year of Griffiths being immobile in this dungeon, he's likely lost up to 90% of his muscle mass. The other consideration is just how frail the rest of his body's become, for example his bones. He's likely now going to be osteoporotic, whereby your bones become really brittle. And the reason this is important is that it increases your risk of suffering from fractures, particularly from low impact, for example just sitting on the floor. To try to regain the physique he once had may well be out of his grasp and impossible. If not, he's looking at several years of recovery.
もう逃げられないよ。
グリフィスをこんな体にしたのか。
その通りだよ。久々に楽しい仕事だった。彼ほどの素晴らしい素材は。
So from what I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Griffiths was subjected to other forms of torture, specifically denailing, flaying of his skin, as well as sexual mutilation from his torturer. And the reason that denailing is such an effective form of torture is that you've got plenty of sensory nerve fibers that go to your fingertips to give you your sense of touch. Now, of course, these nerve fibers are protected by your hard nails, but if these are removed, they're exposed to all of those sensory inputs from your environment. What's worse is that after they've been removed, they take about 6 months to regrow, at which point your torturer can put you through that pain once again.
彼は本当に綺麗だったよ。無駄だよ。
To be honest, in my opinion, this torturer got off light here. Anyone who subjects someone to this amount of mutilation really deserves a horrible end. So, although pretty graphic, Guts was actually quite merciful in ending it quick. What do you guys think?
私は誰かにそばにいてほしかった。
So we've established that Griffiths has been subjected to some of the worst physical torture out there, enough to push him to the end of his sanity. And here he realises and sees that the woman who used to wait on his every word has now fallen for Guts, the one he blames for his current circumstances. This really must have been the last straw for Griffith's sanity. You see, throughout the series, we've seen just how egotistical Griffiths is. He then has his personal image shattered after being defeated by Guts, but he still has his loyal compatriots at his side. Now, seeing that he doesn't even have the affection of that woman he thought would always be his, would only worsen that depersonalization and loss of identity that we spoke about earlier. Really, if you just list them off, Griffiths has lost his looks, his superior fighting ability, and now even the admiration of the Band of Hawks.
グリフィスの手こんなに小さかったんだ。ごめん、代わりの毛布持ってく。グリフィス、やめ。
So here it looks like Griffiths has one last-ditch attempt at throwing himself at Katsuka to gain some form of validation of his worth. However, it looks like Katsuka meets him with some resistance before she reflects and then almost sympathetically accepts his embrace. Now, for someone like Griffiths, who's a narcissist, this would likely have been done with malicious intent, rather than him getting a sympathetic embrace. So the fact that Katsuka reacts in this way would likely consolidate in him that he's actually lost everything. And so I'd imagine in this context that this would likely been enough to push Griffiths off the brink and make him contemplate ending his life.
こんなところで何を怯えている。
行こうよ。まだ遊
So during Griffith's self-loathing, it looks like he has a moment of mental clarity in which he remembers his dream and his purpose, what all of these battles were for, the sacrifices and suffering to become a king. And it's interesting how Griffith hallucinates seeing himself in his ideal form, standing tall before his physical torture. It makes you wonder whether he's gone into one of these dissociative states, whereby to better cope with his situation, he's mentally detached himself from his surrounding environment so that he can escape the trauma of his reality. This would still allow Griffiths to have that feeling of superiority, which is a common trait found amongst narcissists.
そう、少し休みすぎた。終わっていないのだから。
Goodness, so as quick as he regains his hunger for life and his ambition to pursue his dream, reality comes crushing down as he's sent flying from that horse's carriage, landing and breaking his arm. This just really shows how frail Griffith has become, and this injury is a painful reminder of the limitations of his new frail body, which will likely break his delusional thinking that he may well be able to attain greatness once again. With nothing left to live for, and with the realisation of what he's become, Griffith has nothing left to do but laugh. He's completely broken, both physically, emotionally and psychologically. The torture he's endured has finally been effective, as Griffith wants nothing but death to end his suffering, as we see him move towards that jagged rock to try to attempt suicide, but even with this, he fails. You see, one of the worst things about torture is how it dehumanizes a person and breaks down every component of their being. And in the case of Griffith, breaking him down to a vessel that will go on to contain something more inhuman. So guys, if you'd like me to cover any other aspect of the Berserk anime, such as Guts' winter training arc or the Eclipse episode, just let me know down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.